Hello everyone and welcome to today's EAUC webinar. The title of this webinar is Adaptation Part 3, Integrating Adaptation into Normal Business Activities, and it will last approximately 1 hour. Thank you for registering, and thanks also to Penelope Pickering from AECOM, who will be speaking today. My name is Rebecca Petford and I'm the Scotland Programme Coordinator here at the EAUC. If you have any specific event, webinar or training requests, please do get in touch at any time. Just a little bit of housekeeping to go over. I'm hoping that everyone can hear me well. I've muted you all to avoid background noise, and you'll continue to be muted throughout the webinar. If you're having any technical issues at all throughout this webinar, please let me know by either posting in the on-screen chat box, which is bottom right on your screen, or sending me an email to rpetford@eauc.org.uk. We will take questions using the chat box. If you have any questions during the webinar, please write them in the chat box and send them to EAUC using the drop-down menu. I will read them out to Penelope at the appropriate time, so please be as clear as you can in your questions. This webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded as a resource with the presentation later on today. Please feel free to share these resources with any colleagues or fellow EAUC members. Once the webinar is finished, you'll be sent a short survey for us to gain your feedback. Please take a few minutes to complete this survey, as the results will help us to improve our CPD and events. That's all for me for now. Thanks again for registering, and I will pass you over to Penelope.
Hello, well, good afternoon, everyone. Hopefully you can all hear me. Just as a quick side note, we have had a few technical issues this morning, so Rebecca is actually going to be going through the slides for me, so I'll be saying next slide when appropriate. As Rebecca kindly introduced me, my name is Penelope Pickering, and I'm a sustainability consultant at AECOM, and typically the type of work that I deliver is in relation to climate change adaptation and sustainability services. This is typically to critical infrastructure clients, most recently working with the World Road Association, Northern Gas Networks, Transport Scotland, the Environment Agency and the Midlands Highways Alliance. But recently our client base has actually extended into different sectors, hence me being on the call today in terms of going into the education sector and the importance of climate change adaptation across that sector. Irrespective of the sector in which the works were completed, the key messages are generally the same and they're highly transferable. Today's presentation is going to look at how to integrate climate change adaptation into normal business activities across the education sector. And typically this is often seen as the next step towards climate resilience after an organisation has taken steps to firstly identify the risks associated with a changing climate and extreme weather events. Next slide, please. So today we're going to discuss the background to today's webinar, including the previous 2 webinars, which I'm sure a lot of you participated in, and we're going to discuss at what point an organisation needs to begin to integrate climate change into their organisation. We'll also be discussing the barriers associated with adaptation across the education sector, and I'm going to outline exactly why integration is important for yourselves and how a lack of integration can undermine your previous efforts to adapt to a changing climate. Subsequently, we'll look at how the education sector can integrate adaptation into normal business activities despite the barriers which you may come across. And we'll then conclude with the opportunity, as Rebecca said, for any questions from listeners. And as Rebecca said, this can be done in the bottom right-hand corner of your screens. Next slide, please. So continuing on, I'm sure, as I said, a lot of you participated in the previous 2 webinars. The first webinar provided a really good, solid introduction to climate change adaptation, and the second webinar identified the requirements of public bodies in regards to the reporting of climate change. And personally, I was really pleased to see the content of the second webinar especially, as in the past I have been asked by educational institutions what should I be doing? When should I be doing it? And this was a really common theme at the Higher Education Estates Forum, which I presented at earlier this year. I gave a presentation on are my facilities climate resilient? And as I say, a common theme was people not necessarily understanding what they should be doing and when. This third webinar identifies a common hurdle which the education sector is likely to face on their journey to becoming climate resilient, and that, of course, is integrating climate change adaptation within your normal activities. Next slide, please. So in webinar 1, and I think we revisited it again in webinar 2, we were introduced to Adaptation Scotland's 5 stages of climate change adaptation, which is reproduced again for you here. And whilst it might take your organisations a significant amount of resources, educational institutions generally manage to move through the first 3 stages, as shown here, with relative ease as long as they have the appropriate support. So generally, you are able to define the challenges you're going to face, identify the climate threats and opportunities, and then begin to assess and prioritise the risks. However, organisations may then struggle to move past this point in the 5-step process, and you may begin to find it challenging to implement adaptation within your normal business activities. And what that means is that reporting, monitoring and review, so stages 4 and 5, can be compromised, and the cycle of climate change can ultimately remain, climate change adaptation, I should say, can ultimately remain incomplete. Next slide, please. So integrating adaptation within your organisations is challenging because of the number of barriers which you're likely to face. These include, as shown here, stakeholder acceptance and agreement being one, and educational institutions are likely to have a vast number of stakeholders, some of which, such as students, are generally likely to have a heightened acceptance and agreement of the measures needed to adapt to a changing climate. I mean, obviously that's a very generalised statement, but it is something which educational institutions may find less difficult to get that acceptance and that agreement. However, due to resource constraints and the fact that there are so many pools on an education institution's resources, particularly because we need to be meeting strategic objectives, certain stakeholders, so maybe operational staff, senior managers, decision makers, they may be conflicted in regards to how they feel resources are best allocated, which links to the third point on this slide. And it means that sometimes climate change adaptation can fall off the agenda. Common to most organisations, irrespective of the sector, is the lack of knowledge and understanding in regards to climate change adaptation and extreme weather, which I think that the first webinar in particular probably helped to alleviate that problem somewhat, but it can be exacerbated by a lack of a defined communication strategy or channels. Financial constraints, again, they're a common challenge, and colleges, as I'm sure you know, are unable to borrow. And most recently, opportunities for EU funding have been thrown into question with recent events. In order for climate change to be integrated appropriately and effectively across the business, climate change adaptation responses need to be integrated into other relevant internal plans, programs and strategies. And this can be particularly challenging, and it's something which we are going to discuss at quite a lot of detail actually in the latter section of today's webinar. Collaboration with other sectors and stakeholders can also be a barrier, especially in identifying the most appropriate stakeholder and gaining their buy-in. However, typically across the education sector, organisations tend to be quite well connected to the local communities, business networks, and it therefore may be less of a risk. Finally, user behaviour can also be a problem across college estates, university facilities, but generally, again, it is less of an issue compared with other sectors, And this goes back to the whole idea of the fact that a lot of the users in terms of student populations are likely to be more accepting and have a greater agreement with climate change adaptation. Next slide, please. So why is integration important? Well, put bluntly, the first 3 stages of Adaptation Scotland's 5 stages to adaptation, the outputs of those first 3 stages are likely to be compromised without effective integration into normal business activities. So that begs the question of how can we begin to integrate adaptation within our activities despite these barriers? Next slide, please. Thank you. Well, before we go into the practical ways in which we can do that, I wanted to highlight 3 core principles which I think really myself and my colleagues have picked up during our time of working with clients in regards to adaptation and resilience. And I think that these 3 core principles should be considered by any organisation as they begin on their journey of becoming climate resilient. The first of these principles is transparency, and whilst all organisations need to be transparent, public bodies, and particularly those across the education sector, need to be especially so in their operations. This is due to the fact that there are always going to be climate change sceptics, climate change deniers, and whilst these individuals are actually vital to the continued development of the field of climate science, it does put additional emphasis on the need for organisations to be increasingly transparent. And this will, of course, be of importance to current and future student populations and to various other stakeholders and partners, especially those who are providing funding. In addition, there is likely to be uncertainty regarding climate change projections especially. And this should be acknowledged across the education sector, but it shouldn't be seen as a reason not to act or as a barrier to change, but it should be identified. And I think the best approach in terms of uncertainty is to be very flexible in your approach to adaptation and to identify approaches which not only derive benefits in terms of adaptation, but multiple benefits as well. So you're coming up with adaptation responses which are likely to derive other environmental, social or economic benefits. Similarly, there's always going to be limitations in regards to resource availability, in regards to data. However, where there are limitations, we should look, especially in the education sector, for opportunities where we can benefit. So, for example, in terms of knowledge gaps, for example, this can be seen as a research opportunity for higher education and further education. Next slide, please. Thank you. One of the most important considerations across the education sector in regards to adaptation is to how best frame the climate change message. There are a number of useful resources which have been developed to guide organisations through this process, and on this slide here there is actually Adaptation Scotland's guidance, which is Communicating Climate Change Adaptation, a practical guide to values-based communication. And there are lots of really poignant recommendations listed within the guidance and on the screen here. But the main message is to ensure that communications in relation to climate change are relevant to the audience. We need to make our messages applicable to them. We need to ensure that whilst the risks are outlined, so too are the opportunities. But realistically, I'm going to ask the question, how often do we really take these messages on board? Next slide, please. Thank you. For example, recently myself and my colleagues, we worked with a major gas distribution organisation on their aspirations to become climate resilient. And as part of this process, and in order to integrate climate change across their supply chain and their stakeholder network, we held a number of stakeholder workshops. The aim of this workshop was to develop an adaptation response which facilitates a number of benefits beyond that of climate change adaptation. And the idea was that numerous stakeholders would be involved and numerous stakeholders would be benefited by our approach. And again, the concept behind this is that there will be multiple opportunities for collaborative working and even partnership funding, actually. So during this process, it was recommended by a participant that the terminology extreme weather as opposed to climate change be used, as it was deemed that this would be more acceptable to stakeholders. But as professionals and as scientists, we were at first uncomfortable with this proposition, as we wanted to make sure that the correct terminology was being used, and we wanted to feel as though we were educating stakeholders in the right way. But in this instance, we did take a step back, and we just had to be safe in the knowledge that irrespective of the language used, climate change was being communicated in a relatable way, and adaptation was therefore being facilitated. Next slide, please. Thank you. So amongst those participating in today's webinar, it's likely that a number of you are more than aware of the difficulties which there can be in gaining acceptance and agreements, otherwise known as buy-in, from senior management and decision makers. And we found through our experience that developing robust business cases is actually one of the most effective methods of gaining this agreement and acceptance from that senior level. There's been a number of international guidance documents which have been developed. So from left to right here, we have guidance from the Welsh Government, IEMA, the New Zealand Transport Agency, and that's just to name a few. And then at the front of this slide, we have the International Climate Change Adaptation Framework for Road Infrastructure. And this was recently developed by AECOM for the World Road Association. It's subsequently been awarded a Climate Change Business Journal Award, and it is available online. The reason I've highlighted this document today is that it does include a template which I thought might be of interest to today's audience as to how to develop a business case, the messages of which are, as I said previously, transferable beyond that of road infrastructure. When developing a business case, I think one of the most pertinent things that I've realised is so important, especially when it's being pitched at that senior management and decision maker level, is that there needs to be significant reference to the financial and strategic objectives of an organisation. So, for example, we often use the fact that for every pound spent on climate change adaptation now, it's suggested that a further £4 will be saved in the future through a reduced reactive response to climate change risks and extreme weather events. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another example of a recent AECOM project, which I thought might be of interest to you, and it can be used especially when hoping to gain senior management buy-in and decision maker buy-in, is our Weathering the Storm guide, which was produced for small businesses in the West Midlands. And this guidance, again, is transferable in nature, and it sets out the often neglected area of the opportunities which climate change can offer. And it identifies opportunities in terms of saving money and making money. And it's a particularly strong method of gaining stakeholder and senior management buy-in. We found that the way in which this has been pitched has actually been really resonated with the target audience, and this is due to the fact that it is very accessible, the language is simple, and the examples which we've used, again, are practical. I thought it would be interesting to note, actually, that the terminology used in this particular guidance does actually refer to extreme weather, so not climate change as such. I thought it would be interesting going back to our earlier discussion on the workshops we held for the gas distribution clients and how important it is to identify and use appropriate terminology. And just as a quick side note, we're about halfway through the slides now, so as a quick reminder, please do feel free to begin to enter any questions you might have into the chat box. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So continuing with the webinar, and as a brief overview of what is typically included in a business case, I've provided an outline of the key areas that AECOM typically include when we're developing a business case. This guidance especially has come from a key transportation client in Scotland. And generally speaking, a business case should include information on the purpose and drivers of the business case, the climate change risks and extreme weather events which the organisation is likely to be affected by, identification of key risks and opportunities going forward for the organisation, and the likely costs and benefits of climate change adaptation. And something which is typically often missed from the business cases which I've seen is that there needs to be an identification on the business case of what response is required from the target audience. Does a decision need to be made as a result of this business case? I think that's really important to note. Next slide, please. Thank you. Once adaptation responses have been identified by an organisation, it's essential that roles and responsibilities for each response are allocated to appropriate individuals. And this is in order to enable the success of an adaptation response. It allows people to gain ownership, if you like, of their tasks. And this is best achieved, we have found, through the development of an adaptation action plan. We've developed a number of these action plans for our clients, and generally they include information relating to the proposed actions, so what exactly is the adaptation response going to be, how we're going to deliver it, the programme, so the start, review and end dates, how an action will be funded, and where possible, obviously, we always try and identify opportunities for partnership funding. And also there should be a level of priority assigned to each action, such as if an action is a quick win or whether it's a longer term goal. Next slide, please. Thank you. However, in order to successfully implement adaptation across the education sector, representatives, these people who have found themselves being assigned these roles and responsibilities, they need to have sufficient training. And training should facilitate access to robust information, should be across at all levels, and once individuals have access to efficient training and all the information they require, it's likely to enable an increased awareness, capability and knowledge in regards to climate change adaptation. In addition to effective training, there should also be a mechanism which allows people to provide feedback at a strategic or a management level. And by enabling this, it allows people to feel as though their opinions are valid and that they are being taken on board. Effective training and feedback is likely to be supported by a robust internal and external communication strategy as well. So this could comprise things such as knowledge sharing with external organisations. I know a lot of education organisations are partnered with, say, the Met Office, the Environment Agency. And what we need to do is at the internal level, is we need to make sure that the users, such as the student populations, are being made aware of all of these investments which are being made to facilitate a sustainable future for the organisation. Next slide, please. Thank you. As previously mentioned, integration of adaptation into existing plans, policies and procedures can be a barrier to climate resilience. And this is an area which AECOM is particularly knowledgeable on. And I think the reason behind that is probably because it's one of the areas which our clients have required the most assistance with, because it probably is the most challenging. So through previous works, we have identified that there are a number of ways that this barrier can be overcome. And in particular, we've found that a bottom-up approach is generally more effective than a top-down approach, wherein requirements associated with climate change are clearly embedded within operational guidance, for example. So it's really important that people know exactly what they should be doing in their day-to-day job. Through this approach, individuals across different disciplines are made aware, as I say, exactly what's expected of them. But whilst that's important, that's only really one part of it, and it's important that these individuals are supported by adequate resources, which could be tools, guidance, or otherwise. And the rationale behind this approach is that by making things simple, people will more readily use new methodologies, and we do have quite a strong example of that actually later on in the webinar, of where we made things basically easier to do than not do. And I think one of the main challenges with integrating climate change across plans, policies, procedures is the fact that often we need to learn the language of another team. And this can be difficult, but the thing is, it is worth doing, and it can lead to multiple benefits beyond that of adaptation. So it can enable us to understand exactly what each team or sector of an organisation does, and where there may be opportunities for collaborative working. It just helps break down the barriers within an organisation. Next slide, please. Thank you. There is specific guidance available for organisations to help them in regards to integrating climate change within their normal business activities, and particularly into policies, plans and procedures. So this guidance shown on the right here was actually developed by AECOM in order to improve health, well-being and resilience in a changing climate. And the key aim of this particular piece was to provide local practitioners with tools and evidence to take action and embed adaptation within local strategies, assessments and commissioning plans. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just to show that this can actually be done in practice, and it's not just about guidance, most recently AECOM have been involved in making recommendations for a large gas distribution network as to how their plans, procedures and policies can better consider climate change. And the list here identifies the varying sectors that we looked at, including operations, asset risk management, environment, health and safety, and procurement, to name a few. And whilst this really helped the organisation in regards to their climate change resilience aspirations, it actually helped them on a number of other levels, people understanding exactly who's who in the organisation, where they can go to find out certain information, and actually there is that opportunity, as I said, for partnership working. There are likely to be a lot of teams within your organisations who are working together for similar goals, and it's about identifying those people and identifying how you can work together and be more efficient in what you're trying to do. Next slide, please. Thank you. Similarly, for our critical infrastructure client in Scotland, we embedded climate change within tools this time instead of plans and procedures, just so that you can see it is doable and it does work. And for this task, we reviewed the client's disruption assessment tool, which assesses the level of disruption which occurs across their network as a result of a wide range of incidents, including those relating to climate change and extreme weather. And specifically, we compared the outputs from their disruption tool relating to flooding, landslides, rockfall and severe weather. And we compared that against the outputs from a bespoke climate change risk assessment tool which we had developed for the client to understand why the outputs were different, and to then basically identify how our client's tool could better integrate climate change considerations. From this, we made a number of recommendations, and we then consulted upon, or I should say we are going to be consulting upon these recommendations with the users of the tool, which is generally operating companies, so individuals working on the ground. And the main driver behind this is we want to make a tool which is going to be used. It's going to be easy to use, and it's actually going to have a robust output. Next slide, please. Thank you. As our final example of embedding climate change within normal business activity, we recently worked with the same critical infrastructure client in Scotland, but this time in regards to the development of their integrated network information system. And currently this system has the functionality to undertake whole life cost analyses of different maintenance projects. However, the client also wanted to calculate whole life carbon costs in order to balance their economic and environmental drivers and objectives. So what we did is, we developed a whole life carbon bolt-on. It wasn't as easy as that, unfortunately, but this has enabled the system to calculate both whole life carbon and financial costs. And the great thing about this is that the user continues to use the same process as they did previously. The data inputs are all the same, but now the tool will calculate both whole life financial costs and whole life carbon costs. And we anticipate that uptake will be high, going back to the concept that the easier things are for people, the more readily they will engage with new methodologies. Next slide, please. Thank you. And finally, the last stage in ensuring climate change adaptation is integrated effectively within your organisations is to ensure that effective monitoring and management is in place. And through monitoring and management, we can typically identify what's going well for us, so we can identify evidence of good practice. We can identify what needs some work, if there's been any lessons learned, and we can also identify gaps, which obviously is important in terms of, as I said previously, for education institutions. That's an opportunity. A gap is an opportunity for further research. Prioritisation as well. Through effective monitoring and management, we can identify what is becoming a priority for us. And obviously, as time goes by, our priorities are going to change. Hopefully, adaptation measures will be on their way and they can be scaled back. And the environment may change in terms of the financial environment and social environment. And that's obviously going to affect what we prioritise as an organisation. If we have a successful monitoring framework and we have all of the adaptation responses listed, we can typically identify where there may be opportunities for funding as well. So through looking at our adaptation responses, we can identify who relevant stakeholders may be, who we may want to get on board, and whether there is an opportunity to work together and to potentially fund projects together as well. By regularly maintaining and monitoring climate change adaptation action plans in particular, it means that we're held accountable for the progress we're making, and it allows us to keep climate change on the agenda. And as I said, in relation to the prioritisation process, it allows us to identify next steps, as hopefully it will become clear where next needs our resources the most. And throughout all of this process, it's likely that the people involved, their understanding is going to increase, but also general awareness is likely to improve across an organisation as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, in conclusion, we have seen that there unfortunately are multiple barriers to climate change adaptation for the education sector, and we've identified the major hurdle, which is integrating adaptation into our normal business activities. However, that's not to say that it's going to stop us or it's going to prevent us from being resilient, as we've learnt the importance of integrating and embedding climate change adaptation. We've learnt the core principles which we should be working by, and how best to frame our message so that the climate change message is applicable to the audience and it's engaging and it helps to raise awareness and knowledge. Engagement across all levels has been discussed, so we've spoken about how senior management and operatives may be slightly conflicted as to how best to resource climate change adaptation. And then we've learned that in order for things to be successful, we need to make it as easy as possible, and we need to ensure that people with assigned roles and responsibilities know how this fits into their day-to-day activities. And finally, as we just went through, we've seen how important monitoring and management is in regards to keeping climate change on the agenda. Next slide, please. Thank you. So obviously that was a lot of information over a short amount of time. So thank you for bearing with me and listening today. And if you have any questions, I'm sure Rebecca will be able to forward them on to me.
So I've had a couple of questions come in.
Okay.
So the first one is that you mentioned that universities and colleges tend to get stuck after step 3 in the adaptation process.
Yeah.
Do you have any examples of universities and colleges that have undertaken a climate change risk assessment?
Yes. So through the Higher Education Estates Forum that I attended earlier on in the year, what I understood was that typically a small group of individuals, so potentially members from estates, and then generally if there is a sector, so an environmental group within the university, they generally get on board and they manage to, through typically registers, asset registers, they can map the assets that they have, and then they can look at the UK CP09 data, the UK climate change projections data, and they can generally identify which assets are going to be at risk. But when I was speaking with unfortunately I probably shouldn't be giving out the names of the different universities, but when I was speaking with them, they had managed to undertake these assessments, but then they were saying, so what's next? And I think that was a general discussion around the table in terms of people not necessarily knowing what to do after they had got to that stage in the process. So there are a lot of organisations out there who have done that, and I would say it was quite common that people are coming unstuck, if you like, at this stage.
Great, thank you. The next question is, why do you or AECOM refer to monitoring and management as opposed to monitoring and review or monitoring and evaluation?
It's a very good, it's a very good question. I mean, it's just something really that we have gone with. I think review is very much linked to monitoring, whereas I think management, it takes more of a holistic role, I think, if you like. I think it's driven from the fact that we do see climate change as a major threat, a major risk, and we feel that it needs, that's what it needs robust management at all levels. But I'd be interested to maybe open up and to ask people what they think. Is it more effective to use the words review? It's obviously come from a person whose organisation uses that terminology, so that is really interesting, actually.
Well, if you've got any thoughts on that or further questions, please do write them in the chat box. And then we've got one other question, which isn't quite a question. Okay. Would it be possible to provide hyperlinks to the resources you've mentioned?
Yes, absolutely. That's fine. I can do that. It would be, especially some of the resources that we have developed, we would be really keen to share those with you. So what I can do is I'll go away after this session and I'll put an email together. And Rebecca, if you wouldn't mind forwarding that on.
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
That's great. Thank you. Well, that's all the questions we have for now. So Thank you very much to Penelope for your input today. Thank you to you all for tuning in and also for asking questions. I'd like to apologise for the slight delay in getting started. As Penny said, it was due to technical issues, and we hope the alterations we had to make in controlling the slides remotely didn't detract from your learning experience. I will email you all a link to the podcast of this webinar so you can refer to it at a later date and also share it with any relevant colleagues. Please remember to complete the feedback survey when you receive it as well. And I'll also forward those hyperlinks that we get from Penny once I've received them as well. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.